The fastest way to discover who someone really is isn't to give them love. It's to hand them a microphone and an audience. I learned that lesson under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by applause that wasn't meant for me. My name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and for most of my life I believed that quiet work spoke louder than loud people. I built my career one impossible problem at a time, never chasing headlines, never needing strangers to know my name. At home, I thought that same philosophy made for a good marriage. I believed success didn't need to be announced every morning over breakfast. It only needed to be lived. Claire used to believe that too. 20 years ago, she laughed at my terrible jokes in a tiny apartment where the air conditioner rattled louder than the television. We counted every dollar, celebrated every promotion with takeout pizza, and promised each other that no matter who became more successful, we'd always be on the same team. Somewhere along the road, that promise became another framed picture collecting dust. The ballroom at the Grand Ashford Hotel looked exactly the way corporate success always imagines itself. White linen covered every table. Soft gold lighting reflected off polished glass. Executives moved from conversation to conversation carrying champagne flutes as though confidence came bottled. Every smile seemed practiced. Every handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time. Claire belonged there. At least that's what everyone believed. She wore a navy evening dress that matched the company's colors so perfectly it almost looked planned. People stopped her every few feet to congratulate her before the official announcement even began. Rising star. Future executive. The woman everyone expected to climb higher. I stood near the back with a glass of sparkling water, watching her accept compliments that seemed to grow larger every minute. A few coworkers glanced toward me before looking away again. I recognized the expression. Polite curiosity mixed with quiet judgment. I wasn't important enough to introduce. I was simply Claire's husband, the man who appeared in holiday photos and company family picnics, the background character. I had grown used to that role. It never bothered me until that night. Richard Hayes walked onto the stage first, smiling with the effortless confidence of a man who had spent decades believing every room already belonged to him. The applause rolled through the ballroom before he even reached the podium. He spoke about growth, leadership, innovation, and the future. Corporate speeches always sound the same if you listen long enough. Then he invited Claire onto the stage. She walked up with perfect posture, accepting another standing ovation. My chest filled with pride despite everything. Whatever had changed between us over the years, I still remembered the woman who once celebrated getting her first management job by dancing barefoot in our kitchen. I wanted this moment to make her happy. Richard handed her the microphone. She smiled, thanked the board, thanked her mentors, thanked her incredible colleagues. Then she paused. Her eyes drifted across the room until they landed on me. I smiled back without thinking. That was my mistake. She laughed softly into the microphone. People always ask how I stayed motivated through all these years, she said. Honestly, sometimes failure is the greatest inspiration. Every morning, I looked across the breakfast table at my husband and reminded myself I never wanted to settle. Laughter rippled across the ballroom. At first, it came from a few tables near the stage. Then more voices joined in. Someone actually clapped. Richard lowered his head with an uncomfortable smile, but didn't interrupt. Claire kept speaking as though she had delivered the line of the evening. Daniel is a good man, she continued. But ambition isn't something everyone is born with. Some people are simply comfortable watching other people succeed. More laughter. My fingers tightened around the glass until the ice cubes clicked against one another. I didn't look down. I didn't leave. I didn't defend myself. I simply listened as years of private disappointment became public entertainment. Strange how humiliation doesn't always arrive like an explosion. Sometimes it settles quietly across your shoulders. Like winter snow. Heavy, cold, impossible to ignore. Around me, conversations restarted in whispers. A young manager shook his head with a grin. Another executive leaned toward his wife and murmured something that made them both smile. Nobody knew me. Not really. They saw an ordinary man in a charcoal suit standing alone near the back of the room. They saw exactly what Claire wanted them to see. What they didn't know was that someone else inside that ballroom had been watching far more carefully than the audience. And before the evening ended, every person in that room would hear my name for a very different reason. The applause lingered for a few seconds before dissolving into the comfortable hum of expensive conversations. Claire stepped away from the podium, surrounded by executives eager to shake her hand. She never looked back at me. Not once. That hurt more than the joke itself. People think humiliation comes from cruel words. They are wrong. The deepest wound comes when someone you once trusted decides you are no longer worth acknowledging. I remained where I was, my glass still half full, watching waiters glide between tables carrying silver trays loaded with tiny desserts no one seemed interested in eating. Success has a strange smell. Fresh flowers, polished wood, expensive perfume, and just enough pride to make honest conversation disappear. A younger manager approached me with an awkward smile that lasted only a moment. "Rough night," he said quietly before pretending he had forgotten something across the room. He walked away before I could answer. I did not blame him. Nobody wants to stand beside the man everyone else has decided to laugh at. Richard Hayes was surrounded by board members near the stage. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Claire with the satisfied expression of a man convinced he had chosen the right successor. Claire looked radiant, confident, untouchable. Watching her laugh with people who barely knew her reminded me of another night almost 15 years earlier. We had been sitting on the hood of my old pickup truck outside a small apartment building after sharing 2 cheeseburgers because payday was still 3 days away. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered that one day we would build a life where neither of us would ever have to pretend again. I believed every word. Back then, she admired quiet determination. Somewhere between promotions, stock options, and executive retreats, she started admiring something else. Visibility, recognition, status. The higher she climbed, the more invisible I became. It never happened overnight. It arrived in small pieces that seemed harmless at first. She stopped inviting me to networking dinners because she said they would be boring for me. She stopped asking about my work because she assumed consulting was too complicated to explain over dinner. She began introducing me simply as Daniel instead of my husband. Tiny changes, easy to ignore until they formed a pattern too large to deny. The strange part was that I never corrected anyone. I never explained what I actually did. My career had always lived behind confidential agreements, acquisition meetings, and private boardrooms where publicity was considered a liability rather than an achievement. The less attention I attracted, the more effective I became. That philosophy had served me well for nearly 2 decades. Tonight it had become the reason nobody questioned Claire's version of me. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Mr. Whitaker." I turned to find Margaret Caldwell standing beside me. Most guests probably assumed she was simply another distinguished board member. Very few people understood that every major decision inside Caldwell Technologies eventually crossed her desk. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who never needed to remind others of her authority. "I hope you are doing all right," she said. "I have experienced more uncomfortable evenings," I answered with a faint smile. She studied my face for a second longer than most people could manage. "You handled yourself with remarkable restraint." I shrugged. Some moments reveal more than arguments ever could. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Exactly." Before I could respond, another director approached and quietly informed her that the board was ready. She nodded once, but did not leave. Immediately, "Do not go anywhere," she said in an even voice. "The evening is not quite finished." Then she walked toward a private conference room behind the ballroom, disappearing through heavy wooden doors with the rest of the directors. I watched them leave without changing my expression, but inside something shifted. The timing matched the confidential schedule I had received 48 hours earlier. The board had not gathered tonight only to celebrate a promotion. They had another decision waiting behind closed doors, one that only 6 people in the building knew about. Claire was not one of them. Richard was not either. Across the ballroom, she accepted another congratulations while photographers captured smiling faces beneath the company logo. She looked happier than I had seen her in years. I wondered whether she would still be smiling after the board returned. Not because I wanted revenge. Revenge burns too hot and disappears too quickly. I wanted something much simpler than that. I wanted the truth to walk into the room without raising its voice. The ballroom slowly settled back into its rhythm, but something had changed beneath the polished surface. Most people could not feel it. They were too busy congratulating one another, comparing quarterly numbers, and celebrating promotions that looked permanent. I had spent enough years inside executive boardrooms to recognize the silence that comes before a decision. It always felt different. Conversations became slightly forced. Smiles lasted a little too long. People who normally enjoyed attention suddenly began checking the closed conference room doors every few minutes. They did not know why. They only sensed that something important was happening beyond them. Claire certainly did not notice. She was standing beside Richard Hayes near the stage while photographers captured another round of smiling pictures. Every flash reflected off the crystal chandeliers like tiny bursts of lightning. Richard rested one hand lightly against her shoulder as he introduced her to regional directors from Chicago, Dallas, and Seattle. From across the room, they looked like the future of the company. I wondered if either of them realized how quickly the future could change. A waiter stopped beside me with a silver tray. I exchanged my empty glass for another sparkling water. Alcohol had never helped me think clearly, and tonight required clarity more than comfort. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. Only one message appeared on the screen. It came from a private number that almost nobody possessed. 3 simple words. They are ready. I locked the screen without replying. My role had always required patience. Negotiations failed when people rushed toward victory instead of allowing the facts to arrive on their own. 3 years earlier, I had first encountered Caldwell Technologies during the worst financial quarter in its history. Publicly, the company looked healthy. The annual reports appeared strong. Investors remained optimistic. Behind closed doors, however, the balance sheets told another story. Several overseas acquisitions had been approved without proper oversight. Operating costs were climbing faster than revenue. Cash flow projections looked polished on presentation slides, but collapsed under independent review. Someone had been managing appearances instead of managing reality. Margaret Caldwell had contacted my firm through a confidential referral. She did not ask me to rescue the company. She asked me to discover whether it deserved to be rescued at all. For nearly 18 months, I worked quietly with a small advisory team, reviewing contracts, interviewing department heads, and rebuilding financial models that no longer reflected reality. Nobody inside the organization knew my name because every report carried only the name of Whitaker Strategic Holdings. That anonymity protected the process. Personal relationships could not influence facts if nobody knew who was collecting them. Eventually, the board adopted nearly every recommendation we submitted. Debt was restructured. Unprofitable divisions were closed. Capital was redirected into stronger markets. The stock recovered slowly, then steadily. Industry analysts praised the company's remarkable turnaround without ever identifying the people responsible for designing it. I preferred it that way. Recognition fades. Results remain. Claire knew only fragments of that story. Early in the project, I explained that I had accepted a long-term consulting assignment involving strict confidentiality agreements. She smiled, kissed my forehead, and wished me luck. Months later, she stopped asking about it altogether. My work became invisible because it did not produce magazine interviews or social media headlines. She measured success by visibility. I measured it by stability. Somewhere along the way, those two definitions stopped living in the same house. My thoughts were interrupted by Chad Benson, one of Claire's senior directors. He approached with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he understood exactly where everyone belonged. "Daniel," he said with a friendly grin, "I hope you did not take Claire's joke personally. You know how these celebrations are. Everybody likes a little humor." I returned his smile. "Do they?" He laughed awkwardly. "She has worked incredibly hard for this promotion." "She certainly has," I answered. He nodded, apparently satisfied that I had accepted my place in the evening's entertainment. "Well, enjoy the reception." As he walked away, I realized something important. Chad was not a cruel man. He was simply responding to the version of me he had been shown. Perception is a powerful thing. If enough people repeat the same story, eventually nobody asks whether it is true. The conference room doors finally opened. Every conversation inside the ballroom slowed almost instantly. Margaret Caldwell stepped out first, followed by the other directors. None of them were smiling for the cameras anymore. Their expressions carried the quiet certainty of people who had already made up their minds. Margaret looked across the room until our eyes met for a brief second. She gave the smallest nod imaginable, barely noticeable, easy for everyone else to miss. I understood it immediately. The waiting was over. Margaret Caldwell stepped onto the stage without asking for attention. She never had to. The room quieted on its own, as though years of authority carried a sound people instinctively recognized. Conversations faded. Champagne glasses lowered. Even the photographers stopped adjusting their cameras. Richard Hayes straightened his jacket and smiled toward the audience, clearly expecting another round of congratulations. Claire moved beside him with the same confident expression she had worn all evening. She believed the next few minutes belonged to her. I stood exactly where I had been for the past hour, near the back of the ballroom, hands resting loosely at my sides. Sometimes the strongest position in a room is the one nobody notices until it is too late. Margaret thanked everyone for attending before pausing long enough for complete silence to settle across the ballroom. This evening, she said, has been a celebration of achievement. It has also been the conclusion of a comprehensive strategic review that began nearly 3 years ago. Richard's smile barely changed, but I noticed his shoulders stiffen. Claire looked toward him for only a second before returning her attention to the stage. Neither of them understood where the speech was heading. Many of you know the results, Margaret continued. You have seen stronger financial performance, healthier long-term planning, and renewed confidence from our investors. What very few people know is how close this company came to making decisions that could have permanently damaged its future. The room became perfectly still. Executives exchanged uncertain glances. Several directors folded their arms. Nobody interrupted. Margaret never wasted words. Every sentence moved with purpose. 3 years ago, she continued, our board retained an independent strategic advisor under strict confidentiality agreements. We asked one individual to evaluate every major division, every acquisition, every financial projection, and every executive recommendation without influence or personal relationships. Richard slowly turned toward the directors standing behind Margaret. His confident smile had become smaller now, replaced by careful curiosity. Claire remained calm, although I noticed her fingers tighten around the stem of her champagne glass. She was beginning to realize this announcement had nothing to do with her promotion. Margaret looked across the ballroom one more time before speaking again. Tonight, the board has unanimously accepted the final recommendations from that review. She paused. Effective immediately, we are implementing the next phase of leadership. A quiet murmur rolled through the audience. Somebody whispered that perhaps Richard was retiring. Another guessed a merger announcement was coming. Every theory sounded reasonable because nobody imagined the truth. Margaret lowered the folder in her hands. Daniel. My name echoed through the ballroom with surprising clarity. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Several guests looked around the room, unsure who she meant. Others glanced toward the registration table as though another Daniel might suddenly appear. Margaret smiled gently. Daniel Whitaker, would you please join me on the stage? Hundreds of eyes turned in my direction at exactly the same time. The transformation happened almost instantly. Faces that had ignored me all evening suddenly searched for recognition. Chad Benson blinked twice before taking an unconscious step backward. The young manager who had avoided standing beside me stared with his mouth slightly open. Claire looked directly at me, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Richard's smile disappeared completely. I walked forward without rushing. The polished floor reflected the ballroom lights beneath every step. My heartbeat remained steady. I had imagined this moment many times over the previous 48 hours, but reality felt strangely quieter than expectation. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered another joke. The same people who had dismissed me less than 30 minutes earlier shifted aside without being asked, creating a clear path toward the stage. It struck me how quickly perception changes when authority enters the room. I climbed the steps and shook Margaret's hand. She held it for only a moment before turning back toward the audience. Allow me to properly introduce the man responsible for designing the restructuring strategy that restored this company's financial stability. A wave of astonishment swept across the ballroom. Margaret continued before anyone could interrupt. For the past 3 years, Daniel Whitaker has served as the board's independent strategic advisor through Whitaker Strategic Holdings. Every major restructuring initiative, every capital allocation recommendation, and every governance reform approved during that period originated from his analysis. Complete silence followed. Claire's eyes remained fixed on me as though she were trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of the same person. The husband she believed she understood no longer matched the man standing beside the chair of the board. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it simply stands under bright lights, waiting for everyone else to notice what had been there all along. For several long seconds, the ballroom forgot how to breathe. Faces that had dismissed me an hour earlier now searched my expression for answers they had never cared to ask before. Margaret Caldwell allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. Leadership is not measured by how loudly someone celebrates success, she said. It is measured by whether an organization becomes stronger after that person leaves the room. Her words floated across the ballroom with calm precision. Nobody applauded. They were still trying to understand what they had just heard. Richard Hayes cleared his throat and forced a polite smile. Margaret, I knew the board had retained outside advisors over the years, but I was never informed that Mr. Whitaker was personally involved. Margaret looked toward him without changing her expression. That was intentional. Independence only works when influence is removed from the process. Richard nodded once, but the confidence that had carried him all evening was beginning to fade. Claire remained motionless beside him, still holding the champagne glass she had forgotten to drink from. Her eyes stayed fixed on me, searching for some explanation that would restore the version of reality she had believed only minutes earlier. I understood that feeling. Years ago, I had looked at her with the same confusion, wondering when the woman who celebrated small victories had become someone who measured people by titles and applause. Margaret continued, "There is one more announcement." Every head in the room lifted again. Following the completion of the strategic review and after a unanimous vote from the board earlier this evening, Daniel Whitaker has accepted our invitation to serve as executive chairman and interim chief executive officer while we begin the next phase of organizational leadership. This time the silence broke into a wave of astonished whispers. Someone near the front quietly repeated my name. Another executive reached for a phone before thinking better of it. Chad Benson looked from Richard to Claire and then back to me, as though trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces no longer fit together. Richard took one slow breath before stepping toward the microphone. "Congratulations," he said carefully. "I certainly was not expecting that development." His voice remained professional, but years spent negotiating executive contracts had taught me to recognize controlled disappointment. Margaret thanked him with a courteous nod before turning toward me. "Daniel, would you like to say a few words?" Hundreds of eyes followed me as I stepped toward the podium. Earlier that evening, those same eyes had watched Claire transform me into the evening's punchline. Now they waited for a response. I rested one hand lightly on the edge of the podium and looked across the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected softly against polished glass. White tablecloths stretched across the room like untouched snow. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. "Thank you," I began quietly. The microphone carried my voice without effort. "I appreciate the confidence the board has placed in me. I also appreciate every employee who has worked tirelessly to strengthen this company over the past several years. Businesses succeed because ordinary people choose excellence every single day, even when nobody notices." I paused for a moment. Leadership is not about proving that one person is more important than another. It is about creating an environment where respect does not depend on job titles. The room remained perfectly still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. I have always believed that reputations can be manufactured, but character eventually introduces itself. Tonight is not about celebrating one individual. It is about protecting the future of this company and the people who depend on it. I stepped away from the microphone. The applause began slowly, almost cautiously, before spreading throughout the ballroom. It sounded different from the applause Claire had received earlier. That applause had celebrated an image. This applause carried uncertainty, curiosity, and perhaps a little respect. As I returned beside Margaret, I noticed Claire finally set her untouched champagne glass onto a nearby table. Her hand trembled only slightly, but it was enough for me to notice. She took one hesitant step toward me before stopping herself. Whatever words she had prepared disappeared before reaching her lips. Across the stage, Richard remained composed, yet his eyes had become noticeably more guarded. The evening had shifted in ways none of them had anticipated. And although the room believed the biggest surprise had already happened, I knew the board meeting earlier that night had uncovered far more than a simple leadership transition. The hardest conversations were still waiting behind closed doors. The applause gradually faded into cautious conversations, but nobody rushed toward the exits anymore. The celebration had transformed into something entirely different. Executives who had spent the evening discussing promotions were suddenly comparing notes in hushed voices. Department directors checked their phones, searching for information that did not exist yet. Nobody likes discovering that the story they believed all night was only the first chapter. Margaret Caldwell quietly thanked the guests before inviting the board members and senior executives into a private conference room adjoining the ballroom. Richard Hayes adjusted his jacket and forced another composed smile before following the directors inside. Claire hesitated near the doorway, clearly uncertain whether she should enter with the same confidence she had carried only minutes earlier. One of the corporate secretaries stepped beside her and politely said, "The board has requested that you attend as well." Claire nodded without speaking. As she walked past me, our eyes met for the first time since her speech. She opened her mouth as though searching for an explanation, then closed it again. Some conversations cannot begin until pride steps aside. We entered the conference room one after another. The room itself was simple compared to the ballroom outside. A long walnut table stretched through the center beneath soft recessed lighting. No decorations, no photographers, no applause. Just folders, water glasses, legal pads, and the quiet weight of decisions that would affect hundreds of employees. Margaret sat at the head of the table. I took the seat beside her that had been reserved hours before the reception even began. Richard noticed the nameplate in front of my chair for the first time. His eyes lingered on it for only a second before he slowly sat across from me. Claire remained 2 seats farther down, unusually silent. The woman who had commanded a ballroom with effortless confidence now avoided looking directly at anyone. Margaret folded her hands together. "Thank you all for remaining this evening. Before we conclude today's proceedings, there are several governance matters that require immediate attention." The company attorney distributed identical folders around the table. Nobody opened them immediately. Years of executive meetings had taught everyone that the first sentence often mattered more than the documents. Margaret continued. As part of Mr. Whitaker's strategic review, several operational concerns were identified over the past 18 months. Most have already been resolved. A small number remain outstanding. Richard leaned forward. "What concerns are we discussing?" His voice remained calm, but I recognized the subtle tension beneath it. Margaret nodded toward me. "Daniel." I opened the folder in front of me without rushing. Every page had already been reviewed dozens of times before tonight. Facts never become stronger because they are delivered dramatically. They only become clearer. Approximately 14 months ago, I began, our advisory team noticed irregular approval patterns involving executive-level capital requests. Individually, none exceeded internal authorization thresholds. Collectively, however, they represented a governance weakness that required additional review. Richard frowned slightly. "Are you suggesting policy violations?" "I am suggesting procedural inconsistencies," I answered evenly. "Which is precisely why an independent audit was recommended." Nobody interrupted. Claire slowly opened her folder. I watched her eyes move across the first few pages before stopping on a summary chart. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. She recognized several project names immediately. Those initiatives had helped build her reputation inside the company. Margaret spoke again. "To be absolutely clear, tonight is not about assigning personal blame. Good governance requires transparency, regardless of titles or relationships." That sentence settled over the room with quiet authority. It was one of the reasons investors trusted her judgment. She never turned business into personal theater. Richard cleared his throat. "Has the audit been completed?" "Yes," I replied. The findings confirm that several executive recommendations bypassed the level of financial review expected by this board. Most recommendations were ultimately profitable. A small number were not. More importantly, the approval process itself no longer reflected the standards this company promises its shareholders. Claire finally looked up from the report. "Why was I never informed that these reviews were taking place?" she asked softly. I met her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Because the review was intentionally independent. Every executive was evaluated under the same process." She lowered her gaze again without responding. The room became very quiet. Outside the conference room windows, The ballroom lights still shimmered across polished marble floors, but the celebration already felt like it belonged to another evening. Margaret closed her folder and looked around the table. Beginning tomorrow morning, every outstanding recommendation will be re-examined under the new governance structure. No exceptions. Titles will not determine accountability. Facts will. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The truth has a peculiar quality. Once it is documented, emotion becomes remarkably unconvincing. And sitting there beside the people who had underestimated both my work and my silence, I realized the evening had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about giving the company the kind of leadership that did not depend on appearances. The meeting continued well past the hour when most hotel staff expected the evening to end. Outside, the ballroom had almost emptied. Floral arrangements still decorated the tables, untouched desserts sat beneath soft lights, and the last few employees quietly gathered their coats. Inside the conference room, however, nobody seemed aware that midnight was approaching. Time moves differently when reputations are being measured against facts. Margaret Caldwell reviewed the implementation schedule one page at a time, while the corporate attorney recorded each board resolution. Every decision followed procedure. Every vote was documented. Nothing depended on personalities anymore. That was the difference between public applause and private governance. One is built on perception. The other survives only through evidence. Claire remained unusually quiet throughout the discussion. Every so often she glanced toward me before returning her attention to the documents in front of her. I recognized that expression. It was not anger. It was confusion. She was trying to reconcile years of assumptions with a reality she had never bothered to investigate. Richard Hayes, on the other hand, asked careful questions about timelines, reporting structures, and communication plans. His experience allowed him to understand exactly how significant the board's decisions would become over the next several weeks. "When will department leaders be informed?" he finally asked. Margaret answered without hesitation. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Transparency begins immediately. She then turned toward me. "Daniel, I would like you to outline the first operational priorities." I nodded and opened another folder. "Our objective is stability, not disruption. Every employee should arrive tomorrow knowing that their work remains important. We are reviewing processes, not searching for public embarrassment. Department managers will receive written guidance before business hours begin. Financial approvals above established thresholds will require temporary dual authorization while governance updates are completed. Internal reporting channels will remain confidential. No one should fear asking honest questions." Several directors nodded in agreement. One of the independent board members smiled slightly. "That approach reflects exactly why we selected you." I thanked him with a simple nod. Leadership rarely improves because someone gives a dramatic speech. More often it improves because ordinary people know what tomorrow will look like. As the meeting drew closer to its conclusion, Margaret closed her notebook and looked toward Claire. "Before we adjourn, is there anything you would like to add regarding your division?" Claire hesitated for several seconds. Earlier that evening, she would have answered immediately. Now she chose every word carefully. "My team has worked extremely hard over the past year," she said quietly. "I hope their work continues to be evaluated fairly." "It will," I answered before anyone else could respond. Every face turned toward me. Performance deserves recognition regardless of organizational changes. Strong employees should never carry responsibility for decisions beyond their authority. Claire looked at me with genuine surprise. Perhaps she had expected criticism. Perhaps she believed I wanted the room to remember her speech from earlier that night. I did remember it. I simply refused to let it decide who I would become. Margaret smiled almost imperceptibly before bringing the meeting to a close. "Thank you, everyone. We begin a new chapter tomorrow." Chairs slid back across the polished floor as directors gathered their folders. Quiet conversations replaced formal discussion. The tension that had dominated the room slowly gave way to thoughtful silence. One by one, the board members shook my hand before leaving. Several introduced themselves properly for the first time, despite having unknowingly worked beside me for years through confidential reports and strategic recommendations. Richard approached next. He extended his hand without hesitation. "Congratulations, Daniel. We clearly underestimated one another." I accepted the handshake. The company comes first. If we remember that, everything else becomes easier. He nodded once. I hope we can work well together. So do I. He offered a respectful smile before walking toward the exit. Only Claire remained inside the conference room after everyone else had gone. She stood beside the long walnut table, holding the folder against her chest as though it somehow made the room feel smaller. For several quiet moments, neither of us spoke. The silence between two strangers lasts only seconds. The silence between two people who once shared a life can feel much longer. Finally, she looked up. How long? She asked softly. I already knew what she meant. How long have you been doing all of this? I answered honestly. Long before tonight. She lowered her eyes and released a slow breath. I never knew. I looked through the conference room windows toward the empty ballroom, where only a handful of lights remained on. No, I said calmly. You never asked. Claire remained standing by the conference table long after the others had left. The room had become almost silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of hotel staff clearing the ballroom outside. She looked smaller somehow, not because her position had changed, but because certainty had disappeared from her posture. Confidence is easy to carry when the world agrees with you. It becomes much heavier when the truth arrives without warning. She finally looked at me again. Why did you never tell me? She asked. Her voice was steady, but the certainty that once defined every sentence had faded. I rested both hands lightly on the back of a chair before answering. I tried in the beginning. She frowned. No, you never. Then she stopped speaking. Memory has a strange habit of arriving one quiet piece at a time. I watched recognition slowly replace confusion. Years earlier, I had mentioned confidential meetings that required travel. She had answered emails while I spoke. Later, I had brought home financial reports that could not be discussed because of non-disclosure agreements. She laughed and said corporate consulting sounded boring. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain. Not because I wanted secrets between us, but because conversations only work when two people are listening. You always said you were consulting, she whispered. I was. I thought. She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. I already knew the rest. She thought consulting meant small projects, temporary assignments, invisible work without influence. She had quietly built an entire version of my life using assumptions instead of questions. I gave her a gentle smile that carried more sadness than satisfaction. People rarely see what they never choose to look for. She lowered herself into one of the chairs and stared at the folder lying open in front of her. When did everything between us change? That question lingered in the room much longer than either of us expected. It deserved an honest answer. I do not think it happened all at once, I said. I think it happened every time success became something that had to be displayed instead of shared. Every promotion became your promotion. Every achievement became your story. Somewhere along the way, there stopped being an us. She rubbed her hands together slowly, looking toward the empty seats where the directors had been sitting only minutes before. I never meant to make you feel invisible. I nodded once. I believe that. She looked surprised by my answer. You do? Yes. Intentions matter. But outcomes matter too. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside the conference room, a hotel employee rolled a cart across the marble floor. The sound echoed briefly before disappearing into the quiet hallway. Claire released a slow breath. The joke tonight. She stopped again, searching for words that refused to come easily. It was supposed to make people laugh. It did. She closed her eyes for a moment. I know. There was no anger inside me anymore. Anger had disappeared long before the ballroom filled with applause. It had slowly been replaced by disappointment and eventually by acceptance. Those emotions are quieter, but they last much longer. I picked up the folder containing tomorrow's implementation schedule and closed it carefully. Tomorrow morning, everyone will be watching how we lead, I said. That includes both of us. She looked up immediately. You are still willing to let me stay? The question carried genuine uncertainty. Your team delivered strong results, I answered. Nothing in tonight's review changes that. Positions should be earned or lost because of performance, not personal feelings. If I ignore that principle on my first day, then everything I said to the board becomes meaningless. She studied my face as though trying to decide whether I truly believed those words. The truth is that leadership becomes easy when people agree with you. Real leadership begins when fairness costs you something. Claire slowly nodded. I do not know how to fix what I broke. I looked toward the dark ballroom beyond the glass walls where workers were folding white tablecloths and stacking empty chairs. Just a few hours earlier, that room had been filled with applause, bright lights, and carefully rehearsed speeches. Now it looked ordinary again. Some things cannot be repaired in one conversation, I said quietly. They can only be rebuilt one honest decision at a time. She followed my gaze toward the empty ballroom. For the first time that evening, neither of us seemed interested in titles, promotions, or executive offices. We were simply two people standing among the quiet remains of a celebration that had revealed far more than anyone expected. And as we walked toward the hallway together without another word, I realized that tomorrow's hardest decisions would not appear inside board reports or financial statements. They would begin the moment ordinary employees looked to us for an example of what integrity was supposed to look like. The next morning, the headquarters looked exactly as it always had. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying coffee cups. Elevator doors opened and closed every few seconds, and the reception desk greeted visitors with the same practiced smiles. From the outside, nothing had changed. The biggest transformations rarely announce themselves. They simply begin while everyone is busy following familiar routines. I arrived just before 7:30, long before the first executive meeting. The sunrise reflected against the glass exterior of the building, turning every window into a sheet of gold. For a brief moment, I stood outside looking at the entrance where hundreds of employees would soon begin another ordinary workday. They deserved stability more than they deserved drama. That thought stayed with me as I walked through the front doors. Several employees recognized me from the previous evening. Their expressions shifted from surprise to polite respect. A few offered quiet congratulations. Others simply nodded before continuing toward their offices. Nobody mentioned Claire's speech. Nobody repeated the joke that had filled the ballroom only hours earlier. Success has a way of rewriting conversations without saying a single word. At 8 o'clock, the executive leadership team gathered inside the main conference room. The atmosphere was noticeably different from previous meetings. There were no whispered side conversations, no casual laughter, and no assumptions about how the morning would unfold. Margaret Caldwell introduced the new governance structure before inviting me to outline our priorities. I stood at the front of the room and looked around the table. Claire sat halfway down the left side with a notebook already open. Richard Hayes sat across from her, listening carefully. Every face reflected the same question. What kind of leader would I become now that nobody doubted my authority? Good morning, I began. Our objective is simple. We will build a culture where respect is earned through integrity, decisions are supported by evidence, and every employee understands that their work matters. We are not here to erase the past. We are here to improve the future. I explained the governance updates, the revised approval procedures, and the commitment to transparent communication. Nobody interrupted because nothing required defending. The recommendations had already been reviewed, debated, and approved by the board. When the meeting concluded, department leaders left with clear direction instead of uncertainty. That was exactly how leadership should feel. Claire waited until everyone else had exited before gathering her notebook. She walked toward me without hesitation. I reviewed the implementation schedule, she said quietly. My division can complete the reporting updates by Friday instead of next week. I smiled. That would help everyone. She nodded. Then that is what we will do. There was no awkward attempt to rewrite history. No dramatic apology delivered in front of an audience. Just two professionals discussing the work that needed to be done. Somehow that honesty meant more than any speech could have. Over the following weeks, the company settled into its new rhythm. The audit confirmed stronger controls. Communication improved across departments, and employees gradually stopped talking about the unusual evening that had changed so much. They became focused on projects, clients, and the future again. That was the outcome I had hoped for from the beginning. Organizations thrive when people stop worrying about personalities and start trusting principles. Claire changed as well. Not overnight and not because of embarrassment. She began asking questions instead of making assumptions. She listened more carefully during meetings. She gave credit to her team before accepting it herself. Those changes were small, but real growth almost always begins quietly. Our marriage did not magically return to what it had been years before. Some distances cannot be erased simply because the truth has been revealed. Trust is rebuilt the same way a strong company is rebuilt. One honest decision at a time. One promise kept after another. Looking back now, I rarely think about the applause, the promotion, or the moment an entire ballroom realized they had misunderstood me. Those memories matter far less than the lesson they left behind. Titles can be awarded. Wealth can be hidden. Recognition can arrive and disappear with the next news cycle. Character is different. Character reveals itself in the moments when nobody expects kindness, when silence would be easier than fairness, and when power could be used to settle old scores but chooses not to. If that evening taught me anything, it was this. Never measure your worth by the loudest voice in the room, because applause fades, assumptions collapse, and public opinion changes with astonishing speed. The only reputation that truly lasts is the one you build when nobody is watching. Everything else is only noise.